NCERT Biology textbook for 12th standard. First chapter, Reproduction in Organisms. Each and every organism can live only for a certain periods of time. The period from the birth to the natural death of an organism represent its lifespan. Lifespan of a few organisms are given in figure. Several other organisms are drawn for which you should find out their lifespan and write in a space provided. Examine the lifespan of the organism represented in a figure. Isn't it both interesting and intriguing to note that it may be short as a few days or as long as a few thousand years? Between these two extremes are the lifespan of the most other living organisms. You may note that lifespan of the organism are not necessarily correlated with their size. The size of the crows and the parrots are not very different, yet their lifespan shows a wide differences. Similarly, a mango tree has a much shorter lifespan as compared to the peepal tree. However, be the lifespan, the death of the every individual organisms is the certainty. That is, the no individual is immortal except a single cell organisms. Why do we say there is no natural death in a single cell organism? Given this reality, have you ever wondered how vast number of the plants and animal species have existed on earth for several thousand years? There must be some processes in living organisms that ensure that this continuity. Yes, we are talking about the reproduction, something that we take from the granted. The first is reproduction. Reproduction is defining as a biological process in which an organism gives rise to the new young ones, that is the offspring similar to itself. The offspring grow, mature and in turns produce a new offspring. Thus there is a cycle of birth, growth and the death. Reproduction enables the continuity of the species generation after generations. You will study later in chapter number 5th, that is the principle of inheritance and the variation. How genetic variation is created and inherited during the reproduction. There is a large diversity in the biological world, and each organism has evolved its own mechanism to multiply and produce the offspring. The organism's habitat, its internal physiology and the several other factors are collectively responsible for how it reproduces, based on whether there is a participation of one organism or two in a process of the reproduction. It is of two types. When offspring is produced by single parents with or without the involvement of gamete formation, the reproduction is asexual. When two parents opposite sex participate in the reproductive processes and also involve the fusion of the male and the female gamete, is called as a sexual reproduction. Now the 1.1 is the asexual reproduction. In this method, a single individual or a parent is capable of producing offspring. As a result, the offspring that are produced are not only identical to one another but are also exact copy of their parent. Are these offspring likely to be genetically identical or different? The term clone is used to describe such a morphological and the genetical similar individuals. Let us see how widespread the asexual reproduction is. Among the different groups of organisms, asexual reproduction is common among the single cell organism and in plants and animals with relatively the simple organization. In protists and the monerans, the organisms or the parents cell divides into the two to give rise to a new individuals. Thus, in these organisms, cell division is itself a mode of reproduction. Many single cell organisms reproduces by binary fission, where the cell divides into the two halves and each rapidly grows into an adult. For example, amoeba and paramecium. In yeast, the division is unequal and the small buds are produced that remain attached initially to the parent cell, eventually get separated and mature into a new yeast organism or cell. Under unfavorable conditions, the amoeba withdraws its pseudopodia and secretes a 3-layer hard covering or a cyst around itself. This phenomenon is termed as encystation. When favorable condition returns, the encysted amoeba divides by a multiply fission and produces the many minute amoebas or a pseudopodiospore. The cyst wall bursts out and the spores are liberated in a surrounding medium to grow up into many amoebas. This phenomenon is known as sporulation. Member of the kingdom fungi and the simple plants such as the algae produce through the special asexual reproductive structures. The most common of these structures are the zoospores that usually are the microscopic motile structures. Other common asexual reproductive structures are conidia in penicillium, buds in hydra, and gemmules in the sponges. You have learned about the vegetative reproduction in plant in 11th standard. What do you think? Is a vegetative reproduction also a type of asexual reproduction? Why do you say so? Is the term clone application to the offspring formed by vegetative reproduction? While in animals and other simple organisms the term asexual is unambiguously, in plants the term vegetative reproduction is frequently used. In plants, the unit of vegetative propagation such as the runners, rhizomes, suckers, tubers, opside, bulbs are all capable of giving rise to a new offspring. These structures are called as vegetative propagules. Obviously, since the formation of this structure does not involve the two parents, the process involved is the asexual. In some organisms, if the body breaks into the distinct pieces, that is the fragments, each fragment grows into an adult capable of producing offspring. For example, the hydra. This is also a mode of asexual reproduction called as a fragmentation. The most have heard about the scourge of the water bodies or about the terror of Bengals. This is nothing but the aquatic plant or the water hyacinth, which is one of the most invasive weeds found growing wherever there is a standing water. It drains the oxygen from the water, which leads to the death of the fishes. You will learn more about in chapter number 13 and 14. You may find it interesting to know that this plant was introduced in India because of its beautiful flowers and the shape of leaves. Since it can propagate vegetatively at a phenomenal rate and spread all over the water bodies in a short period of time, it is very difficult to get rid of them. Are you aware how the plant like potato, sugarcane, banana, ginger, dahlia are cultivated? Have you seen the small plants emerging from the buds called as eyes of the potato tubers from rhizomes of the bananas and the ginger? When you carefully try to determine the site of the origin of the new plantlets in a plant listed above, you will notice that they invariably arises from the nodes present in the modified stem of these plants. When the nodes come in contact with a damp soil or water, they produce the roots and the new plants. Similarly, adventitious buds arises from the notch present at the margin of the leaves of the bryophyllum. This ability is fully exploited by gardener and the farmer for the commercial propagation of such a plant. It is interesting to note that the asexual reproduction is a common method of reproduction in the organism that have relatively simple organization, like algae and the fungi, and that they shift to the sexual method of the reproduction. Just before the onset of the adverse condition, find out how sexual reproduction enables these organisms to survive during the unfavorable conditions. Why is the sexual reproduction favors under such conditions? Asexual or a vegetative as well as the sexual mode of reproduction are exhibited by higher plants. On the other hand, only sexual mode of the reproduction is present in most of animals. 1.2 is the sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction involves the formation of the male and the female gametes either by same individuals or by different individuals of opposite sex. These gametes fuse to form a zygote which develops to form the new organisms. It is an elaborate, complex and the slow process as compared to the asexual reproduction. Because of the fusion of the male and the female gamete, sexual reproduction results in the offspring that are not identical to the parents or amongst themselves. A study of the diverse organisms, plants, animals or fungi shows that though they differ so greatly in external morphology, internal structure and physiology, when it comes to the sexual mode of reproduction, surprisingly, they share a similar pattern. Let us first discuss what features are common to these diverse organisms. All organisms have to reach a certain stage of growth and maturity in their life before they can reproduce sexually. The period of growth is called as a juvenile phase. It is known as a vegetative phase in plants, and this phase of the variable duration in a different organisms. The end of juvenile or vegetative phase, which marks the beginning of the reproductive phases, can be seen easily in the higher plants when they come to flower. How long does it take for the marigold or a rice or wheat or coconut or mango plants to come to flower? In some plants where the flowering occurs more than once, what would you call the interflowering period, or a juvenile or a mature? Observe a few trees in your area. Do they flower during the same month year after year? Why do you think the availability of fruits like the mango, apple, jackfruit, etc. is seasonal? Are there some plants that flower throughout the year and some others that shows the seasonal flowering? Plants, the annual and the biennial types, shows a clear-cut vegetative, reproductive and a senescent phases. But in the perennial species, it is very difficult to clearly define these phases. A few plants exhibit an unusual flowering phenomenon. Some of them, such as the bamboo species, flower only once in their lifetime, generally after 50 to 100 years, produce a large number of fruits and dies. Another plant, the Strobilanthes kunthiana, flower once in 12 years. As many of you would know, this plant flowered during the September to October in 2006. Its mass flowering transformed the large tracts of the hilly areas in Kerala, Karnataka and Tamil Nadu into the blue stretches and attract a large number of tourists. In animals, the juvenile phase is followed by the morphological and physiological changes prior to the active reproductive behavior. The reproductive phase is also called of the variable duration in the different organisms. Can you list the changes seen in a human being that are the indicative of the reproductive maturity? Among the animal, for example, the birds, do they lay eggs all through the years, or is it a seasonal phenomenon? What about their animals like frog, and the result. You will notice that birds living in a nature lays egg only seasonally. However, birds in the captivity, as in a poultry farms, can be made to lay egg throughout the year. In this case, the laying egg is not related to the reproduction, but it is a commercial exploitation of the human welfare. The female of the placental mammals exhibit a cylindrical changes in the activity of the ovaries and accessory duct as well as hormones during the reproductive phases. In non-primitive mammals like the cow, sheep, rat, deer, dogs, tiger, etc., such cylindrical changes during the reproduction is called as the oestrus cycle. Whereas in the primates, the monkey, apes and the human, it is the menstrual cycle. Many mammals, especially those living in a natural wild condition, exhibit such a cycle only during the favorable seasons in their reproductive phases and are therefore called as seasonal breeders. Many other mammals are reproductively active throughout their reproductive phases and hence called as a continuous breeder. That we all grow old if we live long enough is something that we recognize, but what is meant by the growing old? The end of the reproductive phase can be considered as one of the parameters of the senescence or old age. There are the commitment changes in the body like the slowing of the metabolism, etc. during this last phase of the lifespan. Old age ultimately leads to the death. In both plants and animals, the hormones are responsible for the transition between the three phases. Interaction between the hormones and the certain environmental factors regulates the productive processes and the associated behavioral expressions of organism. Events in the sexual reproduction. After attainment of maturity, all sexes reproducing organisms exhibit an event and processes that have a remarkable fundamental similarities. Even though the structures associated with the sexual reproduction are indeed very different, the events of the sexual reproduction, through elaborate and complex, follow a regulated sequences. The sexual reproduction is characterized by the fusion or a fertilization of the male and the female gametes, the formation of the zygote and the embryogenesis. For convenience, these sequential events may be grouped into the three distinct stages, namely the pre-fertilization, fertilization and the post-fertilization event. 1.2.1 is a pre-fertilization event. This includes all events of the sexual reproduction prior to the fusion of the gamete. The two main pre-fertilization events are the gametogenesis and the gamete transfer. 1.2.1.1 is the gametogenesis. As you are already aware, the gametogenesis refers to the process of formation of the two types of the gametes, the male and the female gametes. The gametes are the haploid cells, and some algae, the two gametes are so similar in appearance that it is not possible to categorize them into the male and the female gametes. They are hence called as a homogamete or isogametes. However, in a majority of the sexual reproduction organisms, the gametes produced are of the two morphologically distinct type are the heterogametes. In such an organism, the male gamete is called as anthrozoids or sperms and the female gamete called as egg or ovum. Sexuality in the organism. Sexual reproduction in organism generally involves the fusion of the gametes from the two different individuals, but this is not always true. From your recollection of the example studied in the class 11, can you identify the cases where the self-fertilization is observed? Of course, the citing such examples in a plant is easy. Plant may have both males and the female reproductive structures in a same plant or a bisexual. or on the different plants are the unisexual. In several fungi and the plants, the terms such as the homothallic or a monoecious are used to denote a bisexual conditions, and the heterothallic or a dioecious are terms used to describe the unisexual condition. In flowering plants, the unisexual male flower is a staminate, that is the bearing a stamens, while the female is a pistillate or bearing a pistil. In some flowering plant, both the male and the female flowers may be present on the same individuals or a monoecious, or on the separate individuals, that is the dioecious. Some examples of the monoecious plants are the cucurbits and the coconut, and of the dioecious plants are the papaya and the date palm. Name the type of the gametes that are formed in the staminate and the pistillate flowers. But what about the animals? Are individuals of all species, either the male or the female, are the unisexual, or are there species which possess both the reproductive organs or the bisexual? You probably can make a list of the several unisexual animal species: earthworm, sponges, tapeworm, and the leech. Typical examples of the bisexual animals that possess both male and the female reproductive organs are hermaphrodite. Cockroach is an example of the unisexual species. Cell division during the gamete formation. Gamete in all heterogametic species are of the two types, namely the male and the female. The gametes are the haploid through the parent plant body from which they arises may be either haploid or diploid. A haploid parent produces a gamete by mitotic division. Does this mean that meiosis never occurs in organisms that are haploid? Carefully examine the flow chart of the life cycle of the algae that you have studied in 11th standard, chapter number 3rd, to get a suitable answer. Several organisms belonging to the Monera, fungi, algae, and the bryophytes have a haploid plant body, but in organisms belonging to the pteridophytes, gymnosperm, and angiosperm, the most of the animals, including human beings, the parental body is a diploid. It is obvious that a meiosis, the reproduction division, has to occur if a diploid body has to produce a haploid gametes. In diploid organism, the specialized cells called as a meiocytes or a gamete mother cells undergo the meiosis. At the end of the meiosis, only one set of the chromosome get incorporated into each gamete. Carefully study the table if fill the diploid and the haploid chromosome numbers of organism. Is there any relationship in the number of the chromosome of meiocytes and the gametes? Now the 1.2.1.2 is a gamete transfer. After their formation, male and the female gamete must be physically brought together to facilitate the fusion or the fertilization. Have you ever wondered how the gamete meets? In majority of organisms, the male gamete is a motile and the female gamete is a stationary. Exceptions are a few fungi and the algae, in which the both types of the gametes are motile. There is a need for the medium through which the male gamete moves. In several simple plants like the algae, bryophytes, pteridophytes, water is a medium through which these gamete transfer take place. A large number of the male gamete, however, fail to reach the female gamete. To compensate this loss of the male gamete during transport, the number of male gamete produces is several thousand times the number of female gamete produced. In seed plants, the pollen grain are the carried of the male gametes and the ovule have the egg. Pollen grain produced in an anther therefore have to transfer to the stigma before it can lead to the fertilization. In bisexual, the self-fertilizing plant, for example the pea, transfer of the pollen grain to the stigma is relatively easy as anther and the stigma are located close to each other. The pollen grains soon after they are the shade come in a contact with the stigma. But in cross-pollinating plants, including dioecious plant, a specialized event called as a pollination facilitate the transfer of the pollen grain to the stigma. The pollen grain germinate on the stigma and the pollen tube carried the male gamete reach to the ovule and discharge the male gamete near the egg cell. In dioecious animals, since the male and the female gametes are formed in a different individuals, the organism must involve the special mechanism for the gamete transfer. Successful transfer of and the coming together the gametes is essential for the most critical events in the sexual reproduction, the fertilization. The most vital event in the sexual reproduction is perhaps the fusion of the gamete. This process, called as a syngamy, results in the formation of the diploid zygote. The term fertilization is also often used for this process. The term syngamy and the fertilization are frequently used, though interchangeably. What would happen if the syngamy does not occur? However, it has to be mentioned here that in some organisms like the rotifers, honeybee, and even some lizard and the birds, that is the turkey, the female gamete undergo the development to form the new organism without fertilization. This phenomenon is called as a parthenogenesis. Where does the syngamy occur? In most aquatic organisms such as the majority of the algae and the fishes as well as amphibians, the syngamy occurs in the external medium or water that is outside the body of the organism. This type of the gamete fusion is called as external fertilization. Organisms exhibit the external fertilization shows a great synchrony between the sexes and release a large number of the gametes into the surrounding medium, that is the water, in order to enhance the chance of the syngamy. This happens in the bony fishes and the frogs where a large number of the offspring are produced. A majority disadvantage is that the offspring are extremely vulnerable to the predators, threatening their survival up to the adulthood. In many terrestrial organisms belonging to the fungi, higher animals such as the reptiles, birds, mammals, and in majority of the plants, the bryophytes, pteridophytes, gymnosperm, and angiosperm, the syngamy occur inside the body of organism. Hence, the process is called as internal fertilization. In all these organisms, egg is formed inside the female body where they fuse with the male gamete. In organism exhibiting internal fertilization, the male gamete is motile and has to reach the egg in order to fuse with it. In this event, though the number of sperm produced is very large, there is a significant production in the number of egg produced. In seed plant, however, the non-motile male gametes are carried to female gametes by pollen tube. 1.2.3 is a post-fertilization event in the sexual reproduction after the formation of zygote called as a post-fertilization event. 1.2.3.1 is the zygote. Formation of diploid zygote is a universal in all sexual reproducing organisms. In organisms with external fertilization, the zygotes are formed in the external medium, usually water, whereas in those exhibiting the internal fertilization, the zygote is formed inside the body of organism. Further development of the zygote depends on the type of the life cycle the organism has and the environment it is exposed to. The organisms belonging to the fungi and the algae, the zygote develops a thick wall that is a resistance to the desiccation and the damage. It undergoes the period of the rest before the germination. An organism with haplontic life cycle, as you have read in 11th standard, the zygote divides by the meiosis. to form a haploid spore that grows into the haploid individual. Consult your class 11 book and find out what kind of the development take place in a zygote in organisms with a diplontic and the haplodiplontic life cycle. Zygote is the vital link that ensures the continuity of species between the organism of one generation to the next. Every sexual reproducing organism, including the human being, begins the life as a single cell, the zygote. 1.2.3.2 is embryogenesis. Embryogenesis refers to the process of the development of the embryo from the zygote. During embryogenesis, the zygote undergoes the division, that is the mitosis, and the cell differentiation. While the cell division increases the number of the cell and developing embryo, the cell differentiated helps the group of the cell to undergo the certain modification to form the specialized tissues and the organs to form and the organism. You have studied about the process of the cell division and the differentiation in the previous class. Animals are categorized into the oviparous and the viviparous based on whether the development of the zygote take place outside the body of the female parent or inside. That is, whether they lays the fertilized or unfertilized eggs to give the birth to the young ones. In oviparous animals like the reptiles and the birds, the fertilized egg covered by the hard calcareous shell and are laid in a safe place in environment. After the period of the incubation, the young ones hatch out. On the other hand, in viviparous animals, the majority of the mammals, including the human being, the zygote develops into the young ones inside the body of the female organism. After attaining the certain stage of the growth, the young ones are delivered out of the body of the female organism. Because of the proper embryonic care and the protection, the chances of the survival of the young ones is greater in a viviparous organism. In flowering plant, the zygote is formed inside the ovule. After fertilization, the sepals, petals and the stamens of the flower wither and fall off. Can you name the plant in which the sepals remain attached? The pistil, however, remains attached to the plant. The zygote develops into the embryo and the ovule develops into the seed. The ovary develops into the fruit, which develops the thick wall called as a pericarp, that is protective in the function. After the dispersal, the seed germination under favorable conditions to produce the new plants. Now the summary of the reproduction in organism. Reproduction enables the species to live generation after generation. Reproduction in organism can be broadly classified into the asexual and the sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction does not involve the fusion of the gamete. It is common in the organisms that have a relatively simple organization such as the fungi, algae and some invertebrate animals. The offspring formed by the asexual reproduction are identical and can be referred to as the clones. The zoospore, conidia, etc. are most common asexual structures formed in several algae and the fungi. Budding and the gemmules formation are the common asexual methods seen in lower animals. Prokaryotes and the unicellular organism reproduce asexually by the cell division or a binary fission of the parent cell. In several aquatic and the terrestrial species of the angiosperm, the structures such as the runners, the rhizomes, suckers, tubers, offsets, etc. are capable of giving rise to the new offspring. This method of the asexual reproduction is generally referred to as the vegetative propagation. Sexual reproduction involves the formation of the fusion of the gametes. It is a complex and the slower process as compared to the asexual reproduction. Most of the higher animals reproduce almost entirely by the sexual method. Events of the sexual reproduction may be categorized into the pre-fertilization, fertilization, and the post-fertilization events. Pre-fertilization event includes the gametogenesis and the gamete transfer, while the post-fertilization events include the formation of the zygote and the embryogenesis. Organism may be bisexual or unisexual. Sexuality in the plants is varied, particularly in angiosperm. Due to the production of the diverse type of the flower, the plants are defined as the monoecious and the dioecious. Flowers may be bisexual or unisexual flower. Gametes are the haploid in nature and unusual, a direct product of the meiotic division, except in haploid organisms where the gametes are formed by the mitosis. Transfer of the male gamete is an essential event in the sexual reproduction. It is relatively easy in a bisexual organism. In unisexual animals, it occurs by the copulation or a simultaneous release. In organism, a species process called as a pollination ensures a transfer of the pollen grains, which carry a pollen grain to the stigma. The syngamy means the fertilization occurs between the male and the female gamete. Syngamy may occur either externally outside the body of the organism and internally inside the body. Syngamy leads to the formation of the specialized cell called as zygote. The process of the development of the embryo from the zygote is called as embryogenesis. In animal, the zygote start the development soon after its formation. Animal may either oviparous or viviparous. Embryonal protection and the care are better in a viviparous organism. In flowering plants, after fertilization, the ovary develops into the fruit and the ovule mature into the seed. Inside the mature seed is a progenitor of the next generation, the embryo. Thank you so much.